There is a moment in every war when courage is tested, not by how many enemies you can kill, but by how many lives you can save when death surrounds you on every side, and the world has descended into absolute hell. In the spring of 1945, on a blood-soaked cliff in Okinawa, Japan, one man stood alone on a battlefield that would later be called Hacksaw Ridge, a place so terrible that soldiers who survived it would wake up screaming for the rest of their lives. This man had no rifle in his hands, no grenades on his belt, no weapon of any kind to defend himself against an enemy that wanted him dead. He was a United States Army medic named Desmond Doss, and while explosions tore the earth apart around him and bullets cut through the air like angry hornets and wounded men cried out in agony from every direction, he made a promise to God that he would save just one more, and then one more. After that, and then one more again. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Desmond Doss had lowered 75 wounded soldiers down a sheer cliff face using nothing but a rope and his own 2 hands, pulling them one by one from certain death while enemy soldiers hunted him and artillery shells rained down, and the entire world seemed determined to kill everyone on that ridge. His fellow soldiers had mocked him, calling him a coward because he refused to touch a gun. His own officers had tried to have him kicked out of the army because they believed a man who would not kill had no place in combat. Even his father had begged him not to enlist, knowing that a soldier without a weapon was a dead man walking. But on that terrible day at Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss proved something that no one thought possible, that the greatest warrior is not always the one who takes the most lives, but sometimes the one who saves them, that true courage is not about killing your enemies, but about refusing to let your brothers die, and that faith can move mountains even when those mountains are covered in blood and fire and death. This is the story of the most unlikely hero in American military history, a man who went to war but refused to kill, who faced hell itself armed with nothing but his medical bag and his unshakable belief that every life is sacred, and who earned the Medal of Honor by doing what everyone said was impossible. This is the story of Desmond Doss, the soldier who saved 75 lives without firing a single shot. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in the small city of Lynchburg, Virginia, a place where the Blue Ridge Mountains met rolling hills covered in tobacco fields, and where everyone knew everyone else's business and Sunday church was not optional. He came into a world that was still recovering from the Great War that had ended just 3 months earlier, a war that had killed millions and left entire nations in ruins, though young Desmond would not understand the weight of war for many years to come. His father was Thomas Doss, a carpenter and handyman who worked with his hands to keep food on the table, a man who had served in World War I and came home carrying wounds that no one could see, the kind that made him reach for the whiskey bottle more often than his family wanted, and the kind that made him wake up at night, thinking he was back in the trenches. His mother was Bertha Doss, a devout Seventh-day Adventist who wore her faith like armor, and raised her children to believe that God's commandments were not suggestions but absolute laws that must be followed no matter what the world said. Desmond grew up with an older sister named Audrey and a younger brother named Harold, and together they lived in a modest home where luxuries were few but love was abundant, where Bible study was as much a part of daily life as breakfast, and where the 10 Commandments hung on the wall in a frame that Desmond stared at every single day. The Doss family attended the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church, and from his earliest memories Desmond absorbed the teachings that would define his entire life, lessons about loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek and honoring the Sabbath, and above all else, the commandment that burned itself into his soul, "Thou shalt not kill." His mother taught him that these words were not negotiable, that God had spoken them directly to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that they applied to every situation in every circumstance without exception. To young Desmond, it was as simple as that. Killing was wrong, period, end of discussion. He did not need to understand the complexities of war or self-defense or national security, because the commandment did not have footnotes or exceptions or fine print. It said, "Thou shalt not kill," and that was enough. but understanding something in your head is very different from living it out when the world tests you, and Desmond Doss would spend his entire life being tested in ways that most people cannot imagine. When Desmond was about 7 years old, something happened that would haunt him forever and cement his commitment to nonviolence in a way that no sermon ever could. He and his brother Harold got into a fight, the kind of scuffle that brothers have where fists start flying and pride gets involved, and neither boy wants to back down. But this fight escalated beyond childish wrestling when Desmond grabbed a brick and in a moment of pure rage hit his brother in the head with it. Harold collapsed, blood pouring from the wound, and for several terrifying seconds Desmond thought he had killed his own brother. The sight of Harold lying there bleeding and motionless sent a wave of horror through Desmond that he would never forget. A feeling that made his stomach turn and his hands shake and his mind scream that he had broken the most sacred commandment of all. Harold survived, thank God, but the incident left a permanent scar on Desmond's soul. From that moment forward, he knew with absolute certainty that he could never take another human life, that the capacity for killing lived inside him as it does in everyone, and that he must never ever allow that darkness to take control again. That brick became a symbol in his mind of everything he must resist, a reminder that violence only leads to more violence, and that the only way to be truly strong is to refuse to use your strength to hurt others. Growing up during the Great Depression meant that the Doss family, like millions of other American families, had to struggle just to survive. Money was scarce, jobs were scarcer, and there were times when dinner consisted of whatever Bertha could scrape together from the garden or the small amount of money Thomas managed to earn from odd carpentry jobs. Desmond learned to work hard from a young age, taking whatever jobs he could find to help support the family, whether it was delivering newspapers or helping his father with construction work, or doing yard work for neighbors. He was not a big kid, and he was not particularly strong, but he was determined and reliable and honest, qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. He also developed a deep love for the outdoors, spending hours exploring the woods and fields around Lynchburg, learning to appreciate the beauty of God's creation and finding peace in nature that he could not always find in the chaos of human society. These quiet moments alone in the forest taught him patience and observation and a kind of calm strength that would become his trademark. As Desmond moved through his teenage years, his commitment to his faith never wavered even as the world around him grew more complicated and dangerous. He attended church every Sabbath, sang in the choir, taught Sunday school to younger children, and lived his life according to principles that seemed increasingly out of step with a world racing toward another global conflict. By the late 1930s, war clouds were gathering over Europe as Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany began its campaign of conquest and brutality, and even across the ocean in America, people could sense that another terrible war was coming. Desmond watched the newsreels at the movie theater showing German tanks rolling through Poland and British cities burning under German bombs, and while he felt deep sympathy for the victims of aggression, he also felt certain that war was never the answer, that violence only begot more violence, and that true Christians must refuse to participate in killing no matter how righteous the cause might seem. His friends and neighbors did not always understand this position, and as war fever swept across America following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Desmond found himself increasingly isolated, a man whose convictions set him apart from the patriotic fervor that gripped the nation. But here is where Desmond Doss proved that he was not a coward hiding behind his religion, not a hypocrite who wanted the benefits of freedom without paying the price, and not a man who lacked courage or commitment to his country. When the call came for men to serve, Desmond did something that shocked many people. He decided to enlist in the United States Army. He could have claimed exemption as a conscientious objector and avoided military service entirely. could have stayed home in Lynchburg working in the shipyard where he had taken a job, could have lived out the war in safety while other men fought and died. But Desmond Doss believed that while he could not kill, he could serve, that while he could not take lives, he could save them, and that being a conscientious objector did not mean being a coward. He believed that serving as a medic would allow him to honor both his faith and his country, to fulfill his duty as an American while staying true to his conviction that all life is sacred. It was a decision that would take him into the deepest circles of hell and test every ounce of his faith. And it was a decision that would ultimately prove that courage has many forms. On April 1st, 1942, Desmond Thomas Doss walked into a military recruitment office and volunteered for service in the United States Army, a decision that set in motion a chain of events that would challenge him in ways he could never have imagined. He was 23 years old, stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed about 140 pounds, and looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. When the recruiter asked him if he was willing to bear arms, Desmond said no. He was a conscientious objector who would serve as a medic but would never touch a weapon. The recruiter looked at him with a mixture of confusion and contempt, probably wondering why this skinny kid who refused to fight even wanted to join the army. But the military needed men desperately, and medics were in short supply, so they accepted him. Desmond was assigned to the Medical Corps and ordered to report for basic training at Camp Lee, Virginia, not far from his hometown. He kissed his mother goodbye, hugged his father and siblings, and boarded the bus that would take him away from everything he knew and into a world that would test his convictions more severely than any sermon or Sunday school lesson ever could. Basic training was hell from day one, not because of the physical demands, although those were considerable, but because Desmond immediately became a target of ridicule, harassment, and outright hostility from his fellow soldiers and even some of his officers. In the military culture of World War II, refusing to carry a weapon was seen as the ultimate act of cowardice, a betrayal of your fellow soldiers who counted on you to have their backs in combat. The other men in his unit could not understand how someone could claim to be brave while refusing to fight, could not comprehend how a man could call himself a soldier while rejecting the very tool that soldiers use to stay alive and protect their buddies. They called him a coward, a sissy, a yellow-bellied traitor who wanted other men to die for him while he hid behind his Bible. They mocked his faith, made crude jokes about his religious beliefs, and did everything they could to make his life miserable. Some of the harassment was verbal, but much of it was physical. They threw boots at him while he prayed, dumped his bunk while he slept, sabotaged his gear before inspections, and even beat him up on more than one occasion. Through it all, Desmond refused to fight back, refused to retaliate, refused to compromise his principles even slightly. He would later say that this was harder than anything he faced in combat because the enemy in combat was trying to kill him, but at least they were honest about it, while the men who were supposed to be his brothers were trying to break his spirit. His commanding officers were no better. Captain Jack Glover, the company commander, believed that Desmond was a liability who would get men killed in combat, and repeatedly tried to have him discharged from the army. Glover argued that a medic who would not defend himself was worthless in battle, that the other men could not be expected to risk their lives protecting someone who refused to protect himself, and that Desmond's presence would undermine unit cohesion and morale. He tried every administrative trick he could think of to get rid of Desmond, including refusing to grant him leave, assigning him extra duties, and even attempting to have him declared mentally unfit for service. At one point, Glover told Desmond directly that he did not belong in the army and that he should just quit and go home before he got someone killed, but Desmond refused to quit. He believed that God had called him to serve, that he had a duty to his country and his fellow soldiers, and that running away when things got hard would be the real act of cowardice. He endured every insult, every beating, every attempt to break him, and he kept showing up every single day ready to do his job. He studied field medicine with obsessive dedication, learned how to treat wounds under fire, practiced bandaging and splinting and giving morphine until he could do it in his sleep, and proved over and over again that even though he would not carry a gun, he was willing to work harder than anyone else to become the best medic he could possibly be. The breaking point came when Desmond was scheduled to go home on leave to marry his fiancée, Dorothy Shutt, a young woman he had fallen in love with back in Lynchburg. The wedding was planned, the church was reserved, Dorothy was waiting for him, and Desmond had been promised leave to attend his own wedding. But at the last minute, Captain Glover denied the leave request, a petty act of cruelty designed to punish Desmond for his refusal to conform. Desmond was devastated, but he refused to go AWOL, refused to defy military authority even when that authority was being used unjustly against him. Instead, he wrote to Dorothy explaining the situation and asking if she would wait for him, if she still wanted to marry a man who was facing such opposition and hatred from his own army. Dorothy's response was immediate and unwavering. She believed in him, she loved him. She understood that his convictions made him who he was, and yes, she would wait. That letter gave Desmond the strength to keep going even when everything in him wanted to give up, even when the harassment became almost unbearable, even when he lay awake at night wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Eventually, Desmond's superiors realized that he was not going to quit, and that they could not legally force him out of the army because conscientious objector status was protected by military regulations, however much they might hate it. They were stuck with him, and he was stuck with them, and they all had to find a way to make it work. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the harassment began to decrease, though it never stopped entirely. Few soldiers started to respect his dedication even if they did not understand his beliefs, started to see that he worked harder than most of them, and started to realize that maybe, just maybe, having a medic who was willing to run into danger to save lives might not be such a bad thing after all. But the real test was still to come because basic training was just the beginning, and actual combat would prove whether Desmond Doss was truly brave or just a fool with a death wish. He completed his training, was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, and prepared to ship out to the Pacific Theater where the war against Japan was raging with unimaginable ferocity. Before he left, he was finally granted leave and married Dorothy in a small ceremony that felt like a miracle after everything he had been through. He promised her he would come home, and she promised to pray for him every single day. Then he boarded a transport ship and sailed toward war, carrying his Bible, his medical bag, and an unshakable faith that God would protect him as long as he stayed true to his convictions. The journey across the Pacific Ocean was long and miserable, weeks spent on a crowded troop transport ship, where thousands of soldiers were packed together in tight quarters with bad food and worse sanitation, and the constant underlying fear of being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Desmond used the time to pray, to read his Bible, and to continue studying medical techniques with other medics, preparing himself mentally and spiritually for what was coming. He knew the fighting in the Pacific was brutal beyond description, that the Japanese fought with fanatical determination and almost never surrendered, that American casualties were staggeringly high, and that medics were among the most dangerous jobs in the war because they had to expose themselves repeatedly to enemy fire while treating wounded men. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it are two completely different things, and nothing could have truly prepared Desmond for the reality of combat. The 77th Infantry Division, known as the Statue of Liberty Division, was designated as a combat unit that would participate in island, hopping campaigns across the Pacific, seizing strategic islands from Japanese control as American forces slowly pushed toward the Japanese home islands. Desmond's first taste of combat came during the Battle of Guam in July and August of 1944, where American forces sought to recapture the island that Japan had seized early in the war. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with Japanese soldiers launching banzai charges in the middle of the night, screaming as they rushed American positions with bayonets fixed, willing to die if they could take even one American with them. Desmond found himself thrown into situations he had never imagined, crawling through mud and blood to reach wounded men while machine gun bullets kicked up dirt all around him, working frantically to stop bleeding and treat shock while explosions shook the ground beneath him, and praying constantly that God would give him the strength and courage to do his job. He saved lives on Guam, many lives, pulling wounded soldiers out of the line of fire and treating them under conditions that would have made civilian doctors give up in despair. But Guam was just the beginning, a preview of horrors to come. After Guam came the Philippines, where the 77th Division participated in the Battle of Leyte, one of the largest and deadliest campaigns of the Pacific War. The fighting in the Philippines was savage, with Japanese forces dug into dense jungles and heavily fortified positions, determined to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. Desmond operated in conditions that defied description. Tropical heat so intense that men collapsed from heat stroke, torrential rains that turned battlefields into seas of mud, diseases like malaria and dysentery that incapacitated entire units, and an enemy that used every trick in the book, including booby traps, snipers, and surprise attacks from supposedly secured areas. He treated soldiers with horrific wounds, limbs blown off by artillery, guts spilled by shrapnel, faces burned beyond recognition by flamethrowers. He held dying men in his arms as they cried for their mothers, tried to comfort them in their final moments, closed their eyes when the light went out. Every night he prayed for strength, and every morning he woke up and did it all over again. The other soldiers in his unit began to notice something remarkable. Desmond Doss ran toward danger when everyone else was running away. He never hesitated to treat a wounded man no matter how exposed the position was, and he had an almost supernatural calm under fire that gave other men courage. The mockery and harassment that had plagued him during training began to fade as combat proved what basic training never could, that Desmond Doss was no coward. During the Philippines campaign, Desmond earned the Bronze Star for heroism after he saved several wounded men despite being under heavy fire himself. But even that recognition did not fully erase the skepticism of some soldiers who still believed that a man without a weapon was fundamentally useless in combat. They would see things differently after Okinawa, but in early 1945, as the 77th Division prepared for its next assignment, many men still doubted whether Desmond truly belonged on the battlefield. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that they were about to enter the most brutal battle of the Pacific War, a battle so terrible that it would traumatize an entire generation, and that in that battle, Desmond Doss would perform acts of heroism so extraordinary that they would seem impossible if they had not been witnessed by dozens of men who were there. In the spring of 1945, the Allied High Command decided that the time had come to take Okinawa, a large island only a few hundred miles from mainland Japan that would serve as the perfect staging ground for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa was heavily defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops who had spent months preparing defensive positions in the island's rugged terrain, determined to fight to the last man and inflict maximum casualties on the invaders. American intelligence knew that Okinawa would be a bloodbath, but there was no alternative. The island had to be taken no matter the cost. The 77th Infantry Division was assigned to participate in the invasion, and Desmond, along with thousands of other soldiers, boarded ships and headed toward what would become the longest and deadliest battle of the Pacific War. The invasion began on April 1, 1945, and at first it seemed almost too easy. American forces landed on the beaches with minimal resistance, advancing inland without the expected fierce opposition. But the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ashijima, was too smart to waste his troops defending the beaches where American naval and air superiority would slaughter them. Instead, he had ordered his forces to retreat to the southern part of the island where the terrain favored defense, where rocky ridges and steep cliffs and a maze of caves and tunnels would turn every advance into a nightmare. The 77th Division was assigned to take one of these ridges, a 400-foot high escarpment that rose almost vertically from the surrounding terrain, covered in jagged rocks and honeycomb with Japanese bunkers and gun positions. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge because its sheer cliff face looked like the edge of a hacksaw blade, but the Japanese had their own name for it, Yoroso-Miura Escarpment, and they intended to make it a killing ground where American blood would flow like water. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge began in late April, and from the very first assault it was clear that this would be unlike anything the 77th Division had experienced before. The ridge could only be climbed using cargo nets and ladders because the cliff was too steep for a normal assault, which meant that soldiers had to climb up essentially defenseless while Japanese troops above them poured down machine gun fire, rifle fire, grenades, and even rocks. Many men were killed before they even reached the top, shot off the nets and falling back down to be broken on the rocks below. Those who did make it to the top found themselves on a lunar landscape of shell craters and shattered trees where every rock could hide a sniper and every hole could conceal a grenade. The Japanese had built an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers that allowed them to pop up, fire, and disappear before American troops could react, to attack from unexpected angles, and to survive artillery bombardments that should have killed everything on the ridge. American casualties were staggering, and progress was measured in yards per day, if progress was made at all. Desmond went up Hacksaw Ridge with his unit, climbing the cargo net with his medical bag on his back and his Bible in his pocket, knowing that once he reached the top he would be entering hell. The sounds alone were overwhelming. The constant chatter of machine guns, the explosion of grenades and mortar shells, the screams of wounded men calling for medics, the shouts of officers trying to direct the chaos, and underneath it all a kind of roar that was all these sounds mixed together into pure auditory horror. The smell was worse. Gunpowder smoke, blood, human waste, decomposing bodies that could not be retrieved from no man's land, all mixing together in the tropical heat to create a stench that made men gag. And the sights were worst of all. Men with limbs blown off still trying to crawl to safety, bodies torn apart by direct hits from artillery, wounded soldiers lying exposed in areas too dangerous to reach, their cries for help growing weaker as they bled out. This was Hacksaw Ridge, and this is where Desmond Doss would prove what true courage means. For days, the battle raged with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. American troops would fight their way forward during the day only to be pushed back by Japanese counterattacks at night. Casualties mounted into the hundreds, then the thousands. The medics worked around the clock, treating an endless stream of wounded men, and Desmond distinguished himself by his complete disregard for his own safety. While other medics understandably sought cover when enemy fire intensified, Desmond continued to move from wounded man to wounded man, bandaging wounds under fire, giving morphine to those in unbearable pain, dragging men to relative safety behind rocks or into shell craters where they could be evacuated. He developed a reputation among the soldiers. If you got hit, if you were lying out there bleeding and thinking you were going to die, Desmond Doss would come for you. It did not matter if you were in an exposed position, did not matter if enemy machine guns were raking the area, did not matter if other medics said it was suicide to try. Desmond would come. He prayed constantly as he worked, asking God to guide him to the wounded and protect him from harm, and time again he walked through enemy fire that should have killed him but somehow never did. Soldiers began to see him as blessed, protected by divine providence, and that belief spread through the ranks until even the most hardened atheists started to think maybe, just maybe, there was something to this Jesus stuff after all. Then came May 5th, 1945, the day that would make Desmond Doss a legend, The day when everything that had come before was just a prelude to the greatest act of heroism that most of these men would ever witness. The battle had been raging for over a week, and the 77th Division had finally managed to establish a substantial foothold on top of the ridge. Hundreds of American soldiers held positions across the plateau, but they were under constant attack from Japanese forces that seemed determined to push them off no matter the cost. On May 4th, the Japanese had launched a massive counterattack, and throughout the night and into the morning of May 5th, they continued to assault American positions with everything they had: artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifle fire, and waves of infantry attacking with bayonets and grenades. The Americans fought back desperately, but casualties were catastrophic. By mid-morning, the situation had become untenable. The Japanese were on the verge of overrunning the American positions, ammunition was running low, and the wounded were everywhere, lying in the open because there was nowhere safe to put them. The order came down: retreat. Withdraw from the ridge, get back down the cargo nets, live to fight another day. It was the only sensible decision because staying meant being wiped out to the last man. The American soldiers began their retreat, helping the walking wounded and carrying those who could not walk on their own, scrambling back toward the cargo nets that were their only way down the cliff. It was a chaotic, desperate withdrawal with Japanese fire cutting down men even as they tried to escape. And in the confusion and terror of the moment, many of the most severely wounded men were left behind because carrying them would have meant certain death for those doing the carrying. This was one of the horrible realities of combat that no amount of training can prepare you for. Sometimes you have to leave men behind or everyone dies. The commanders made the brutal calculation that losing some men was better than losing everyone, and they ordered the retreat to continue. But Desmond Doss had not gotten the message, or if he had, he chose to ignore it. As his fellow soldiers climbed down the cargo nets and disappeared over the edge of the cliff, Desmond stayed on top of Hacksaw Ridge, surrounded by wounded men who could not be moved, and he made a decision that defied all logic and military doctrine. He was not leaving. He was going to save these men or die trying, and he was going to do it alone. The situation he faced was beyond comprehension. He was now the only American soldier on top of a ridge, swarming with Japanese troops, who were hunting for survivors to kill. Enemy soldiers were everywhere, searching through the carnage, shooting wounded Americans where they lay, throwing grenades into craters where men hid. Desmond had no weapon to defend himself, just his medical bag and his faith. Artillery shells were still falling, the entire area was under fire, and common sense said that staying was suicide. But Desmond was not operating on common sense anymore. He was operating on something deeper, something that transcended survival, instinct and military training and rational thought. He looked at the wounded men scattered across that hellish landscape, men crying out for help, men bleeding to death, men who would certainly die if someone did not help them, and he heard a voice that might have been his own conscience or might have been God speaking directly to his soul, and the voice said, "Just one more, save just one more." So that is what he did. Desmond crawled through the chaos, staying low to avoid being seen by Japanese patrols, moving from wounded man to wounded man. He found a soldier with a shattered leg, quickly bandaged the wound to stop the bleeding, gave him morphine for the pain, then dragged him through the dirt and rocks toward the edge of the cliff. The journey was maybe 100 yards, but it felt like 100 miles. Every yard covered while bullets cracked overhead and explosions shook the ground. When he reached the cliff edge, he faced a new problem. How do you lower a wounded man down a 400-foot cliff with a rope? Desmond had learned knots in his youth, had practiced them for years, and he improvised a system using a litter and a rope fashioned into a kind of pulley that would allow him to lower men down while controlling their descent. He tied the first man to the rope, said a prayer, and began lowering him down hand over hand, muscles screaming from the effort, trying not to think about what would happen if the rope broke or if Japanese soldiers spotted what he was doing. The man reached the bottom safely. Other soldiers untied him and sent the rope back up, and Desmond thought, one more, just one more, He went back into the killing zone and found another wounded man. This one had been shot in the abdomen and was going into shock, eyes glazed over, skin cold and clammy. Desmond treated him as best he could with the supplies in his medical bag, then dragged him to the cliff and lowered him down. One more, he found a soldier who had been hit by shrapnel, dozens of metal fragments embedded in his back and legs, bleeding from multiple wounds. Desmond pulled out as many pieces as he could, bandaged the worst wounds, gave him morphine and dragged him to the edge. One more, he found a man with his arm nearly severed by a machine gun burst, the limb hanging by a thread of tissue and tendon. Desmond applied a tourniquet, wrapped the arm as tightly as he could, and got him to safety. One more, all afternoon and into the evening, Desmond Doss worked alone on that ridge, moving between wounded men while Japanese soldiers hunted him and artillery fire rained down. He should have been killed a dozen times over, should have been spotted and shot, should have been hit by shrapnel or blown apart by a grenade, but somehow, impossibly, he kept working. Every time he lowered a man down the cliff, he prayed the same prayer, "Lord, please help me get one more." Just one more, and every time God answered that prayer. Some of the men he saved were conscious and aware of what was happening, men who could not believe that a single medic had stayed behind to rescue them, men who wept with gratitude and fear and relief all mixed together. Others were unconscious or delirious from pain and shock, unaware that they were being saved, their last memory being the assumption that they were going to die alone on that ridge. Desmond did not care if they knew he was saving them or not. He just kept working. His hands were raw and bleeding from handling the rough rope. His body was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced. His medical supplies were running low, and his throat was parched from dehydration and shouting encouragement to wounded men. But he did not stop. One more. As darkness fell, the danger actually increased because now he was working by feel more than sight, trying to find wounded men in the dark while avoiding Japanese patrols that were searching the area. But Desmond had developed a kind of sixth sense for finding the wounded, listening for their breathing or their moans of pain, feeling his way through the darkness, trusting that God would guide him to those who needed help. And God did. By the time dawn broke on May 6th, Desmond Doss had been working for nearly 18 hours straight without rest, without food, without water. He had lowered 75 men down that cliff, 75 soldiers who would have died without him, 75 lives saved by a man who refused to kill. When American forces returned to the ridge the next morning expecting to find only corpses, they found Desmond still up there, barely able to stand, his hands a bloody mess, his uniform torn and filthy, but still checking wounded men for signs of life. The soldiers who climbed back up that cliff could not believe what they saw, could not comprehend that one man had done this alone, could not understand how he had survived when by all rights he should have been dead 10 times over. They surrounded him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, and someone asked him how many men he had saved. Desmond, who had not been keeping count because he was too busy working to think about numbers, shrugged and said he did not know, maybe 50. But the men who had been lowered down the cliff had counted. The officers who received them at the bottom had counted, and the tally came to 75. 75 men who went home to their families because Desmond Doss refused to leave them behind. 75 men who owed their lives to a conscientious objector who everyone had called a coward. You would think that after what happened on May 5th, Desmond Doss would have been pulled off the line, given a rest, maybe even sent home as a hero. But the battle for Okinawa was far from over, and the 77th Division needed every man it could get, especially medics who had proven themselves under fire. So after a brief rest, Desmond was back on the ridge, back in the fight, back to saving lives while bullets flew and shells exploded. His reputation had spread throughout the entire division by now, and soldiers who had once mocked his faith now asked him to pray for them before they went into combat. Officers who had tried to kick him out of the army now specifically requested that he be assigned to their units. Even hardened veterans who had seen every kind of courage in war said they had never seen anything like what Desmond did, and that if this medic who refused to carry a weapon was not the bravest man they had ever known, then courage must not exist at all. On May 21st, American forces launched another major assault on Japanese positions on the ridge, and once again Desmond was in the thick of the fighting. The Japanese had reinforced their defenses and were determined to hold the ridge at all costs, so the fighting was as brutal as ever. Desmond moved through the battlefield treating wounded men as he had done dozens of times before, but this time his luck finally ran out. A Japanese grenade exploded near him, and red, hot shrapnel tore into his legs, shredding the flesh and damaging muscles and nerves. The pain was excruciating, like being stabbed with white-hot needles, and he collapsed unable to stand. Other soldiers rushed to help him, but Desmond, even wounded and bleeding, refused to be evacuated until another medic arrived to take his place treating the other wounded men. Think about that for a moment. He was lying there with his legs torn apart by shrapnel, and his primary concern was not his own survival, but making sure someone else could take care of the other casualties. That is who Desmond Doss was at his core, a man for whom service to others was more important than his own life. While waiting for another medic to arrive, Desmond treated his own wounds as best he could, applying bandages and a tourniquet, even though moving sent waves of pain through his entire body. When the replacement medic finally showed up, Desmond allowed himself to be placed on a stretcher and carried toward the aid station at the rear. But even that evacuation turned into another act of heroism. As the stretcher bearers were carrying him through the battlefield, they came under fire from a Japanese sniper. One of the men carrying Desmond was hit and went down, and in the confusion, Desmond rolled off the stretcher so that other wounded men who were more severely injured could use it. He lay there in the dirt with shrapnel wounds in his legs, waiting for another stretcher to become available, refusing to take priority over soldiers whose injuries he judged to be worse than his own. Then, while still waiting for evacuation, a tank rolled past and Desmond was struck by the tank's side, fracturing his arm in multiple places. So now he had shrapnel wounds in both legs and a compound fracture in his arm, and still, he waited patiently for his turn to be evacuated. Still he encouraged other wounded men to stay calm and keep fighting. Still he demonstrated a kind of selflessness that seemed to come from another world entirely. When Desmond finally reached the aid station and then a field hospital, the doctors who examined him could not believe he was still alive. The shrapnel wounds had caused significant tissue damage, and there was a real risk of infection that could lead to gangrene and amputation. The broken arm required surgery to set the bones properly. He had lost a lot of blood and was severely weakened. They immediately began treatment, stabilized him, and eventually evacuated him to a hospital ship where he could receive more advanced care. His war was over. He had served in some of the worst combat of the Pacific Theater, had saved countless lives, had earned the respect and admiration of every man who served with him, and had proven beyond any doubt that a soldier does not need a weapon to be a warrior. But even as he lay in that hospital bed, recovering from his wounds, Desmond worried about the men he had left behind on Okinawa, prayed for their safety, and wished he could be back there helping them even though his body was broken. The battle for Okinawa continued for weeks after Desmond was evacuated, eventually ending in mid-June with a complete American victory, but at a staggering cost. Over 12,000 American dead and tens of thousands more wounded, plus over 100,000 Japanese military dead and tragically over 100,000 Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and Hacksaw Ridge was one of the bloodiest parts of that battle. The soldiers who survived never forgot what they had seen there, and they especially never forgot Desmond Doss. In the weeks and months following the battle, officers began compiling reports about Desmond's actions, collecting testimonies from soldiers who had witnessed his heroism, and building a case for the highest military honor that the United States can bestow, the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is not given lightly. It requires multiple eyewitness accounts of extraordinary valor far beyond the call of duty, actions that place the recipient's life at extreme risk to save others or accomplish a critical mission. Of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II, only 464 received the Medal of Honor, and many of those were awarded posthumously because the recipients died in the act of heroism that earned them the medal. Desmond Doss would become the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, and the first to receive it while still alive. When he was informed that he had been selected for the award, Desmond's first reaction was to say that he did not deserve it, that he had only done his duty, that any other medic would have done the same thing. But the men he saved disagreed, the officers who witnessed his actions disagreed, and the United States government disagreed. What Desmond did on Hacksaw Ridge was not just duty, it was something far beyond that, something that transcended normal human courage and entered the realm of the miraculous. On October 12, 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender and the end of World War II, Desmond Doss stood in the White House and received the Medal of Honor from President Harry S. Truman. The ceremony was simple but powerful, with military dignitaries and fellow soldiers in attendance, all there to honor a man who had proven that the greatest weapon in war is not always a gun, but sometimes it is faith, compassion, and an unbreakable commitment to saving lives. President Truman placed the medal around Desmond's neck and shook his hand, saying that he had earned the respect of the nation. Desmond, humble as always, simply said thank you and meant it with every fiber of his being. The medal citation detailed his actions, how he had remained on Hacksaw Ridge after his unit retreated, how he had saved 75 men by lowering them down the cliff under intense enemy fire, how he had been wounded multiple times and still refused evacuation until others were cared for first. The words on paper could not fully capture the reality of what he had done, but they tried. The medal changed Desmond's life in ways both good and difficult. On the positive side, he was recognized as a genuine American hero. His story was told in newspapers and magazines across the country, and people who had once scorned conscientious objectors began to understand that refusing to kill did not mean refusing to serve or to sacrifice. Desmond received thousands of letters from grateful families whose sons or husbands he had saved, letters that thanked him for giving them back their loved ones, letters that called him an angel sent by God. He also received speaking invitations from churches and civic groups who wanted to hear his story, and Desmond used these opportunities to share his faith and to explain that what he did was not about being a hero, but about following God's commandments and trusting that if you do the right thing, God will protect you. But fame also brought challenges. Desmond was a quiet, modest man who did not seek attention, and the constant spotlight made him uncomfortable. He also struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though back then they did not have a name for it or effective treatments. He had nightmares about Okinawa, woke up hearing the screams of wounded men, and sometimes had flashbacks where he was back on that ridge surrounded by death and horror. The physical wounds healed slowly, but the psychological wounds would never fully heal. When Desmond returned to civilian life, he tried to resume a normal existence with his wife Dorothy in Lynchburg, Virginia. They bought a small farm where Desmond hoped he could live quietly, raise a family, and put the war behind him. But normal was not something that came easily to a man who had been through what he had experienced. His physical health was a constant challenge because the shrapnel wounds in his legs never fully healed. The broken arm caused chronic pain, and he began to develop tuberculosis, a bacterial infection of the lungs that he likely contracted either during the war or in the unsanitary conditions of field hospitals. Tuberculosis was a serious disease in the 1940s before antibiotics became widely available, and it left Desmond weakened and unable to do heavy physical labor. He spent years in and out of hospitals and sanitariums trying to treat the disease, undergoing surgeries that removed parts of his lungs, enduring treatments that were sometimes as bad as the disease itself. At one point, doctors told him he might not survive, but Desmond's faith never wavered. He believed that God had protected him through Hacksaw Ridge for a reason, and that reason was not to die from disease in a hospital bed. He fought the tuberculosis with the same determination he had shown in combat, and eventually he recovered enough to live something approaching a normal life, though he was never as strong as he had been before the war. Dorothy was his rock through all of this, caring for him through his illnesses, supporting him through his struggles with PTSD, and raising their son Desmond Jr., who was born in 1946. Desmond tried to be a good father, teaching his son the same values of faith and service that his own mother had taught him, taking him to church every Sabbath, and sharing stories about the importance of standing up for your beliefs even when the whole world thinks you are wrong. But he also shielded his son from the worst details of war, never wanted to burden the boy with the horror of what he had seen and done on Okinawa, and hoped that his son would grow up in a world where such things were no longer necessary. He worked various jobs when his health allowed, mostly light duties because his damaged body could not handle hard labor, and he became active in his church and local veterans organizations, where he spoke about the importance of faith in times of crisis. People respected him enormously, not just because he was a Medal of Honor recipient, but because he lived his values every single day, treating everyone with kindness and patience and never using his fame to gain special privileges or attention. As the years went by, Desmond's story began to fade from public memory as new wars and new heroes captured the nation's attention. The Korean War came and went, then Vietnam, and each conflict produced its own stories of valor and sacrifice. But among those who knew Desmond personally, and among the veterans of the 77th Division who had served with him, his legend only grew stronger. At division reunions, old soldiers would seek him out, shake his hand and thank him again for what he had done, some of them breaking down in tears as they remembered how he had saved their lives when everyone else had given them up for dead. Desmond always downplayed his role, always insisted that God deserved the credit and that he was just an instrument, but the men who had been there knew better. They knew that Desmond Doss had performed a miracle on that ridge, and no amount of modesty could change that fact. In the 1960s and 70s, historians began to take a renewed interest in Desmond's story, recognizing that it represented something important about American values and about the complexity of courage. Books were written about him, documentary films were made, and schools invited him to speak to students about the importance of standing up for your beliefs. Desmond participated in these projects when his health allowed, always hoping that his story might inspire others to have the courage of their convictions, to serve their country even if they disagreed with war, and to remember that saving lives is just as heroic as taking them. He also became an advocate for veterans' health care, speaking out about the need to treat PTSD and to recognize that the wounds of war are not always visible. He knew from personal experience how much veterans suffered after coming home, how many struggled with nightmares and flashbacks and guilt, and he wanted to make sure they got the help they needed even if he himself had never received adequate help for his own struggles. Dorothy passed away in 1990, one after 47 years of marriage, and Desmond was devastated by the loss. She had been his partner through everything, the one person who truly understood him, and without her, he felt lost. He remarried a few years later to a woman named Frances May Doss, who cared for him in his final years as his health continued to decline. The tuberculosis had done permanent damage to his lungs. He had hearing loss from all the explosions he had been near during the war, and he was developing other age-related health problems. But his spirit remained strong. His faith never wavered, and he continued to be a living example of what it means to follow your convictions no matter how difficult the path. He lived long enough to see the publication of a biography called The Unlikeliest Hero, and to see his story reach new audiences, and he took satisfaction in knowing that his message about faith and service was still relevant decades after the war had ended. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Desmond Doss entered his final years as one of the last surviving World War II Medal of Honor recipients. He was in his 80s now, his body weakened by decades of health problems, but his mind still sharp and his faith still unshakable. He lived quietly in Alabama with his second wife Frances, spending his days reading the Bible, tending to his garden when he had the strength, and occasionally receiving visitors who wanted to meet the famous medic who had saved 75 lives without firing a shot. He did not seek fame or fortune, did not write a best-selling memoir or go on speaking tours for money, and remained the same humble man he had always been. But the world had not forgotten him, and as the generation that had fought World War II began to pass away, there was a renewed effort to preserve their stories before it was too late. Documentary filmmakers came to interview Desmond, recording his memories of Hacksaw Ridge and his reflections on faith and courage. These interviews revealed a man who had not changed despite everything he had been through, who still believed absolutely in the commandment "Thou shalt not kill," who still maintained that any other medic would have done what he did if given the chance, and who credited God entirely for his survival and success. When asked if he regretted not carrying a weapon, if there were ever moments when he wished he had a gun to defend himself, Desmond answered without hesitation, never. He said that carrying a weapon would have been a sin, that he had trusted God to protect him, and that God had never failed him. When asked if he was ever afraid, he admitted that of course he was afraid, that only a fool would not be afraid in combat, but that fear is not the opposite of courage. Courage is being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Courage is trusting that God will give you strength when you have none left. Courage is loving your fellow man so much that you are willing to die to save him. These simple truths, spoken by an old man looking back on a long life, carried a power that no amount of dramatic storytelling could match. In 2006, Desmond Doss passed away at his home in Alabama at the age of 87. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see his story inspire new generations and to know that his sacrifice had not been forgotten. His funeral was attended by veterans, family members, church friends, and even some of the men he had saved on Hacksaw Ridge, who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the man who had given them a second chance at life. They eulogized him not just as a war hero, but as a man of unshakable faith, a devoted husband and father, a humble servant who had lived his values every single day, and an example of what it truly means to love your neighbor as yourself. He was buried with full military honors, the Medal of Honor resting on his chest, but those who knew him best understood that he would have been just as happy with a simple grave and a cross because he never cared about worldly honors or recognition. What mattered to Desmond was that he had stayed faithful to God's commandments, that he had saved lives instead of taking them, and that he had proven you could serve your country without compromising your soul. The legacy of Desmond Doss extends far beyond his own life and accomplishments. He fundamentally changed how the U.S. military views conscientious objectors, proving that people who refuse to kill on religious grounds can still be valuable soldiers, that moral courage is just as important as physical courage, and that there are many ways to serve with honor. Because of Desmond, subsequent generations of conscientious objectors have been treated with more respect and given more opportunities to serve in non-combat roles without facing the kind of harassment and discrimination that Desmond endured. His story has been taught at military academies as an example of leadership and courage under fire, used in ethics classes to discuss the nature of duty and sacrifice, and shared in churches as a testimony to the power of faith. In 2016, director Mel Gibson released a major motion picture called Hacksaw Ridge that brought Desmond's story to millions of people around the world, winning multiple Academy Awards and introducing new audiences to the man who saved 75 lives without a weapon. The film was not perfect and took some Hollywood liberties with the facts, but it captured the essence of Desmond's heroism and sparked renewed interest in his life and values. Perhaps most importantly, Desmond Doss showed that it is possible to hold fast to your principles even when everyone around you says you are wrong, that standing up for what you believe in requires more courage than simply going along with the crowd, and that true strength is not about overpowering others but about sacrificing for them. In an age of moral relativism where people often compromise their values for convenience or acceptance, Desmond's unwavering commitment to his faith stands as a powerful challenge. He never budged, never wavered, never said that maybe in this one circumstance it would be okay to kill, never made excuses or rationalizations. He believed that God's commandment was absolute, and he was willing to die rather than violate it. That kind of conviction is rare, and it demands respect even from those who might disagree with his theology. Whether you are religious or not, whether you agree with pacifism or not, whether you think what he did was wise or foolish, you cannot deny that Desmond Doss lived according to his deepest beliefs and that his actions proved those beliefs to be not weakness but strength. The men he saved on Hacksaw Ridge went on to live full lives because of him, raised families, built careers, grew old in peace instead of dying young in war. 5 men who became fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren exist only because Desmond Doss lowered their ancestor down a cliff on a rope while the world exploded around him. If you do the math, the number of people alive today because of what Desmond did that day probably numbers in the hundreds, maybe thousands. That is his true legacy, not the Medal of Honor or the movie or the fame, but the ripple effect of lives saved creating more lives in an ever-expanding circle of existence that will continue long after everyone who remembers World War II is gone. In that sense, Desmond Doss achieved a kind of immortality that has nothing to do with monuments or memorials and everything to do with love. The kind of love that makes a man run toward danger instead of away from it, that makes him care more about others than himself, that refuses to give up, even when giving up would be so easy and so understandable. What can we learn from the life of Desmond Doss, and why does his story still matter more than 75 years after the events at Hacksaw Ridge? In a world that often seems increasingly divided, cynical and violent, what does this simple man from rural Virginia have to teach us about courage, faith, and service? The answers to these questions are as relevant today as they were in 1945, perhaps even more so because we live in times that test our values and challenge us to decide what we truly believe and how far we are willing to go to defend those beliefs. First and most obviously, Desmond's story teaches us that courage comes in many forms, and that the bravest person in the room is not always the one with the biggest weapon or the loudest voice. Desmond was mocked as a coward for refusing to carry a gun, but when the real test came, when men were dying and everyone else was running away, he was the one who stayed and fought not with bullets but with bandages, not with violence but with compassion. True courage is not about being unafraid, it is about doing what is right despite your fear. Desmond was terrified on Hacksaw Ridge, just like every other soldier there, but his fear did not control him. He acknowledged his fear, prayed for strength, and then did his duty anyway. That is a lesson that applies far beyond the battlefield. In our daily lives, we all face situations that test our courage, moments when we have to choose between the easy path and the right path, times when speaking up or taking action could cost us socially or professionally or even physically. Desmond's example shows us that real courage means acting according to your values even when doing so is difficult, unpopular, or dangerous. Second, Desmond's life demonstrates the power of unshakable faith and the importance of knowing what you believe. He did not carry a gun not because he was afraid to fight, but because he believed absolutely that killing was wrong according to God's commandments, and no amount of pressure or ridicule or danger could make him compromise on that core conviction. In our modern world, where people are often encouraged to be flexible and open-minded to the point of having no firm beliefs at all, Desmond's unwavering stance reminds us that some truths are worth holding on to no matter what. This does not mean being closed-minded or refusing to listen to other viewpoints, but it does mean having a moral center, a set of non-negotiable principles that define who you are and guide your actions. For Desmond, that center was his Seventh-day Adventist faith, and specifically the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." For others, it might be different principles, but the point is having something you believe in so deeply that you are willing to suffer for it, willing to be misunderstood for it, willing to stand alone for it if necessary. In an age of moral relativism, Desmond Doss stands as a monument to the power of absolute conviction. Third, Desmond's story shows that service to others is the highest calling and that the greatest heroes are often those who give of themselves without expecting anything in return. Desmond did not save those 75 men because he wanted glory or recognition or medals. He saved them because they needed help and he was in a position to provide it, because he believed that every life was sacred and worth preserving, and because he could not live with himself if he abandoned wounded men to die when he had the ability to save them. This kind of selfless service is increasingly rare in a culture that often emphasizes individual achievement and personal success over community and compassion. Desmond reminds us that the measure of a person is not what they accomplish for themselves, but what they do for others. Not how much they accumulate, but how much they give. Not how high they climb, but how many people they lift up along the way. He spent his entire life serving others, first as a medic in combat, then as an advocate for veterans, and finally as an example and inspiration to anyone who heard his story. He never became wealthy, never sought power, never used his fame to gain advantages, and died having given everything he had to help others. That is what true greatness looks like. Fourth, Desmond's experience teaches us about the importance of perseverance and not giving up even when the situation seems hopeless. When he was on Hacksaw Ridge, surrounded by enemy soldiers with no support and no way down except a rope over a cliff, every rational calculation said he should give up, that trying to save those men was suicide, that the sensible thing to do was to retreat while he still could. But Desmond did not operate on rational calculations in that moment. He operated on faith and love and an iron determination to save just one more man, and that one more became 75 because he kept going when anyone else would have quit. This lesson applies to every challenge we face in life. There will be times when the obstacles seem insurmountable, when failure seems certain, when everyone tells you to give up and accept defeat. Desmond's example shows us that impossible is often just a word, that with faith and determination and a refusal to quit, you can accomplish things that no one thought possible, and that sometimes the greatest victories come when you keep pushing forward after everyone else has given up. He prayed, "Lord, please help me get one more," over and over again, and that simple prayer sustained him through an 80-hour nightmare that should have killed him. Whatever your one more is, whatever challenge you face that seems too big, remember Desmond and keep going. Fifth, Desmond's story is a powerful testament to the idea that you can disagree with the methods while still supporting the mission, that you can be against war while still serving your country, and that patriotism does not require you to abandon your principles. This is perhaps one of the most important lessons in our current age of political polarization, where people are often expected to choose between supporting their country and holding to their beliefs. Desmond refused to accept that false choice. He loved America, believed that the fight against fascism was necessary, wanted to do his part to defeat evil, but he also believed that he personally could not kill and that his service had to take a different form. By serving as a medic, he found a way to honor both his faith and his patriotic duty, to contribute to the war effort without compromising his soul. His example shows that there is room for diverse forms of service, that we can respect and value people who take different paths to the same goal, and that unity does not require uniformity. In our divided times, when people who disagree politically or religiously often demonize each other and question each other's patriotism, Desmond Doss reminds us that true patriots come in many forms and that we should judge people by their actions and sacrifices rather than by whether they conform to our expectations. Sixth, Desmond's life teaches us that the battles that shape us most are often internal rather than external. Yes, he faced